Granblue Fantasy is an immensely popular mobile game in the East that has been around for about a decade. So popular that it's spawned an anime adaptation, 2 fighting games by Arc System Works, a manga, and now Granblue Fantasy Relink, an action RPG for PlayStation and PC. The original Granblue Fantasy centers around a bond between the captain of a skyfaring crew and a powerful girl named Lyria. The two became linked together when the captain risked their life to save Lyria's. Together, they have the magical ability to summon what is referred to as a primal beast named Proto-Bahamut, who is essentially a giant magical dragon. After this inciting incident, Lyria and the captain, along with their sidekicks, Catalina and Vern, head off on adventures across the skies, making new acquaintances and fighting primal beasts along the way. As of February of 2022, Granblue Fantasy has amassed an impressive 31 million registered users, a number made even more staggering when considering the game was never officially released in North America. The reason I chose to open this review with this context is because it's context I wasn't privy to prior to starting my journey with Granblue Fantasy Relink. And I think it's important context for any review of this game selling itself to a largely unfamiliar Western audience. When I purchased this game, I only knew that it was an action RPG that was doing incredibly well on Steam. However, after spending roughly 15 to 20 hours with the game and rolling credits, I'm not surprised even remotely by its popularity, even in a market that never had access to the title to which the game owes its existence. Granblue Fantasy Relink is an action RPG that I'm a bit mixed on. Certain elements of it are great. The combat, the set pieces, the diversity of character kits, the replay value, the art, the music. I mean, seriously, there's a seemingly never-ending list of nice things to say about this game. Yet, on the other hand, it's held back by inconsistent writing, terrible pacing, poorly explained mechanics, and heavy gameplay repetition in the back end of the campaign. Also, it doesn't do a good job at bringing in new fans. It just drops you into the deep end. Now, I'm not going to harp on this again for the rest of the review because I understand that this isn't necessarily made for new fans, but I do think it's important to note the unapproachability just in case you're a new player largely unfamiliar with the universe. If you're cool with a lot of skimming wiki summaries and watching cutscenes on YouTube, then you'll be fine. But if you're a fan of action RPGs who doesn't like doing homework to understand the game they're playing, then you may want to steer clear. Also, one last note, I played the majority of the game single player. I tried out matchmaking to make sure it was functional. It is, but for all of the campaign I played solo. Now that my general thoughts and disclaimers are out of the way, let's dive into the game. Let's start by dissecting the story, because it's the part of the game I was initially the most fascinated by. The game opens with the player being given the choice of playing as a male or female captain. The captain then experiences a dream and wakes up on the deck of their airship, the Grand Cipher. Soon after this establishing scene, the ship is raided by hostile forces. During this fight, Lyria and the captain combine forces to summon Proto-Bahamut, the magic dragon I mentioned earlier, and proceed to wipe out these enemies. However, after the fight ends, Proto-Bahamut goes AWOL and begins to attack the crew of the Grand Cipher. This battle ends with Proto-Bahamut being suppressed and the captain and Lyria falling off the deck of the ship and landing on the outskirts of a town called Folka. In Folka, they reunite with the crew of the ship and also hear about a primal god who is affecting the winds of a nearby sky island. The crew believe that this primal god may have been what caused the captain and Lyria to lose control of Proto-Bahamut, so they decide to go investigate it. Once they investigate and neutralize the threat, a group of enemies called the Church of Avia surround the crew. They are immensely powerful and strong in numbers, so the crew doesn't stand a chance in a fight despite their best efforts. The battle ends with the crew being defeated and the Church of Avia kidnapping Lyria because they believe her to be a shaman that they can utilize for their cause. What this cause is, though, is left a mystery for some time. That's all I can say without going into spoiler territory, but the plot of this game is actually pretty intriguing, especially towards the beginning. However, as the game goes on, it gets more and more lost in its own sauce. It's going to be hard to discuss this without spoilers, but I'm going to do the best I can. The easiest starting point would be to discuss the characters. Now, I can't speak on this from the perspective of a fan of the anime or the original game, as I've never interacted with either, so take this not as an informed opinion, but an opinion from someone who's very into ARPGs and did their best to follow what was happening with the characters and who they are. If you looked at my search history right now, all you would find is web pages related to the lore of Granblue Fantasy. I mean, I really gave it my best shot. By far, the characters with the most screen time in this game are the Captain, Vern, Catalina, and a Granblue Fantasy newcomer named Roland. Most of the story comes from these 4, while the rest just chime in with one-liners whenever they get a chance. This is fine, and I actually think it worked for the most part and made sense given the context of the events. In a 15 to 20 hour campaign, you only have so much time to develop characters, so I think it makes sense to use the time you're given to fully flesh out the ones most relevant to the plot. And the Captain, Vern, and Catalina are probably the most relevant because of their close personal relationships with Lyria. And while they aren't the most unique or inventive, the character arcs given to the Captain, Catalina, and Roland are pretty well done. They aren't going to blow you away, and they're pretty predictable, but it's satisfying to watch these 3 learn the lessons they do throughout the game. Roland's is the most interesting because I think it really has valuable lessons about chosen family and rebellion, though I can't talk about specifics without spoilers. The only problem problem with the core cast is Vern, who is insufferably annoying at every turn. I kid you not, the next patch for this game needs a Vern mute button. This bitch got on my every last nerve. By the end of my time with this game, I was ready to rip my hair out every time he spoke. He's just like Morgana was in vanilla Persona 5, but worse, because at least Morgana was giving me useful information most of the time, but I digress. Despite a mostly satisfying cast of core characters, the villains in the game leave something to be desired. There are 4 main villains. 3 of them are military generals for the Church of Avia, whose names I don't remember, and the 4th is Lilith, the head of the entire operation. The villains themselves aren't bad, but they are incredibly derivative of other characters you've seen in ARPGs. And not derivative in an inspiration way, but I feel like I've seen these exact same characters in other games, like Final Fantasy or the Tales series. They also make some really weird decisions towards the end of the game that felt like some of the most egregious plot convenience I've seen in recent memory. Moving on, let's discuss the pacing, because this is easily the worst aspect of the writing and will segue us nicely into the gameplay portion of this review. There's a few massive issues with the pacing in this game, but the one that pertains to the writing is the incredibly bloated third act. So, as I said earlier, the intentions of the Church of Avia and the main villain Lilith are not made clear to the player right away. Now, this isn't always a bad thing, and I think for some stories it can work to hold the villain's cards close to their chest. However, here, I think that is one of the worst choices they could have made. Not knowing what Lilith is planning does nothing but serve as a detriment to the story, because it makes everything feel sort of aimless. We are given no other reason to care about this adventure for our first 10 hours, aside from, our friend was kidnapped. And I think from a storytelling perspective, that's pretty lame and shamelessly lazy. Also, because of this, they wrote themselves into a corner. If the player doesn't have this information until the third act, then the third act has to be egregiously long in order to explain what Lilith is trying to do, show her trying to do it, and then resolving the whole conflict. Now, a long third act isn't a huge problem if your game is 45 hours, but it's not. Acts 1 and 2 are each about 5 hours, and while Act 3 is also 5 hours, it feels like 15 because there's so much exposition happening that should have occurred hours earlier. It got so bad that by the time I got to the last chapter, I was worn out and exhausted and didn't even have the desire to finish it because I already knew what was going to happen and had already slogged through so much. I'm sure some of these issues would be smoothed over by playing with friends, but that's not an excuse. If you're going to advertise and allow for a single player experience, it has to be worthwhile. And to me, the third act of this game was not worthwhile. And it's all made more frustrating because it's such a simple fix in the writing process. All of what's here is good, but the ordering and timing of it all is not. If they had revealed Lilith's intentions at some point in Act 2, around the 5-hour mark, that leaves so much more time to develop all of these arcs that feel so haphazard in the finished product. These pacing issues also deeply impact the gameplay experience. Toward the end of Granblue Fantasy Relink, the game becomes incredibly repetitive. There's a quote from one of my favorite TV shows of all time, How I Met Your Mother, where the main character says this:
"The night we stole a camel." Which means it'll be full of drama dairy. Drama dairy.
I applaud your wordplay, but your core premise is flawed. Every night can't be legendary. If all nights are legendary, no nights are legendary.
This is how I felt towards the end of Relink. The reason for this is the boss fights. These boss fights are fucking sick. Unbelievably good. The music, the art, the movesets, the sound design, the combat, everything about them is stylish and dope as hell. But in the last 6 hours of this game, there are countless amounts of them, to the point where they just get stale. Like, it's absolute sensory overload, and my brain just couldn't take it anymore. It had lost the cool factor it once had. I had a similar issue with Final Fantasy 16, and I think that's the reason I didn't end up finishing that game, despite my love for its narrative. It's less bad here, thanks to a shorter runtime, but it's still an absolute slog. Also, the final mission involves you fighting a bunch of reskins of bosses from earlier in the game, which I just absolutely fucking despise. It's one thing to do this in a 50-hour game where you haven't fought that boss in maybe 20 hours, but in a game with a sub 20-hour runtime, it really feels like they were just trying to pad it out, and I don't think it was necessary. Also, some of the later bosses just get fucking noisy. There's so many things happening all at once that are just impossible to keep track of, so you'll just get hit by attacks you didn't know existed before you have a chance to react. This really sucks and leaves a poor lasting impression for anyone who isn't interested in sticking around for an endgame grind. It also completely kills any sense of momentum the game had going into the final hour. It's just a mess. Speaking of killing momentum, let's talk about the grinding in this game. In the late game, grinding becomes essential unless you want to drop the difficulty. Over the course of a main mission, I would probably gain about 2 levels, but when I'd go into the next main mission, the enemy levels would go up like 5, resulting in me getting absolutely creamed by some of the final bosses in the game. And it's not a skill issue thing either. The final boss has a fatal attack that cannot be dodged and requires you to do a certain amount of damage during the windup to stop it. I was about 3 levels under leveled for this fight and just simply could not do enough damage to stop this attack back from activating. So here I am on the final boss, and I realize that pretty much no matter what, I have to leave the battle and go grind. That sucks. Now, if I was 10 to 15 levels under-leveled, I wouldn't have been that mad. But I had already done a fair amount of grinding, having beaten most of the quests at least once, and I still had more grinding to do. That's a shitty feeling, and again, just leaves a bad taste in my mouth towards the end of a game I was really enjoying. However, despite that bad taste left in my mouth, I couldn't forget the aspects of the game that are truly great. The diversity of gameplay stylings present in Granblue Fantasy Relink is something most other games couldn't dream of. It's funny playing this game coming off of Suicide Squad because this game's gameplay diversity is the antithesis of that. Relink features 20 playable characters, of which I've experimented with about 10, and all of them have had vastly different playstyles that made a meaningful impact on my gameplay experience. I'm gonna highlight 4 of them, each with their own style, strengths, and weaknesses. Let's start with Yugen. Yugen is a hybrid character. He has a rifle and grenades that he can use to fire at range, but on top of that, he can also switch to a button-mashy brawler style to deal with enemies nearby. Yugen is a perfect middle ground, jack-of-all, master-of-none type of character. Then, continuing on with the theme of range, we have Io. Io is another character in the starting party that is incredibly fun to control and can fight at range. But instead of using guns, Io uses magic. There's a ton of fun combos and maneuvering you can do with Io. Plus, she does great damage, and the art and animations on the magic is just splendid. Moving away from the core cast, there's Lancelot, who can be unlocked with a ticket you get from tackling difficult missions or progressing the main story. Lancelot's kit is mostly based around freezing his enemies in place and slashing them up as quickly as humanly possible before they unfreeze. This was an incredibly satisfying thing to pull off that I never got tired of. The last character I'd like to discuss, and also my favorite, is Fairy. Fairy's kit is based around a whip that she has in her arsenal that is incredibly quick and effective in the mid-range. She can execute sick combos with the whip that are incredibly fun and fluid. She can also send out animal projections to do battles with her, which do a lot of damage and are cute to watch. All 4 of the characters I've discussed so far have vastly different styles of play, and encourage and discourage very different things, but they all coexist and influence each other in a smooth and seamless way. This is a really hard thing to pull off, as proven by the release of Suicide Squad earlier this month, so I respect the hell out of the team at Cygames for being able to execute a system this complex. Another thing I respect the shit out of them for is the core gameplay and progression loop. Now, everything I say in this section is said with 2 caveats. 1 is the grinding I mentioned earlier. That was not fun. 2, I haven't played much since rolling the credits, so I can't speak too much to the endgame. However, if Steam player numbers and word of mouth is anything to go by, the endgame is also quite engaging. But I can't speak on that, so I will leave videos down below that talk about that subject. What I can speak to, though, is the excellent progression systems in the campaign. Progression in Relink is based around 2 things: upgrading your weapons and forging new ones, and upgrading your mastery, which is essentially a giant skill tree. The weapons part was less engaging. Sure, it's always cool to see numbers go up, but there's nothing tangibly different about your weapons when you upgrade them or craft new ones. The core gameplay is still the same, you just do more damage. However, the mastery tree is a whole other discussion. The mastery tree allows you to unlock new skills, which are activated by holding the right bumper and a corresponding face button. These skills, coupled with the variety of the character's core kits, allows you to create super niche builds where you can specialize in specific aspects of the combat that you enjoy. If you like fighting from afar, play a ranged character and use ranged and healing skills. If you like getting dirty and fighting up close, play a brawler and use high damage melee skills. You can optimize whatever character you're playing to be the best at whatever aspect of their kit you enjoy the most. It's a very deep and interesting system that's clearly designed to have you coming back for many hours, which is always nice to see. Now, to unlock all these skills I'm mentioning, you must use mastery points, which can be attained from progressing the story or the questing system, which is basically a bunch of ancillary objectives that reward XP in conjunction with items to trade with vendors. These quests get pretty repetitive, but what makes them engaging is the experimentation. In main missions, you are usually just using what you're comfortable with and what's known. At least that's what I did. But when I went into quests, I made a conscious choice to try new things, and I was never disappointed. It's also a good way to hone skills on a character you like and find what works best for your playstyle. I kind of looked at these quests as a practice range, designed to improve your abilities. I'm sure they're much less fun once you're in the late game and have already done all that optimization, but over the course of my 20 hours, I had fun fucking around with these. The only time they weren't fun was when I had to use them to grind, as I mentioned earlier. The last thing I want to talk about before I wrap this thing up is the visuals and audio, which are among the best I've seen it in an ARPG recently. I'm going to split it up into 3 sections: voice acting, music, and visuals. The English voice acting in Relink is pretty good. It's nothing amazing. There's definitely some people phoning it in, or trying too hard. I'm looking at you, Vern. but overall it's solid. The highlights of the cast are Erica Lindbeck and Sean Chiplock, who play Catalina and Roland respectively. To be fair, in the script of this game, I think these two characters have the most depth, so these two actors had easier material to work with, but still, I think it takes a good actor to be able to truly portray that depth, and I think Lindbeck and Chiplock did that with truth and heart. There's also Kira Buckland, who turns in a pretty good performance as Lyria, but she doesn't have enough screen time to make a real impression. Aside from the three I mentioned, everyone ranges from good to passable, with no one delivering a performance I would call bad, which is nice to see. I remember an era where all games localized from Japanese had some of the worst acting you've ever heard, so it's nice to see that times are changing. Speaking of time changes, let's talk about the music. A little music joke for all you nerds out there. The music in Granblue Fantasy Relink is exceptional. There's already a fight in my mind over the best soundtrack of the year between this and Suicide Squad, and it's only February, which is always exciting to see. This soundtrack is pure city pop meets orchestra, and I'm so down with it. The highlights of the score are mostly found in the back end of the game, which is ironic. When the game is trying its absolute best to be boring as fuck, the music comes in and carries the entire experience on its back. It's the only aspect of the game that is consistently great throughout. Boss themes are great, the cues for cinematics are excellent, but I think the music shines in the quieter moments. There's a sequence towards the end of the second act where our characters are exploring a desert area, and there's just little musical cues throughout that fit the tone incredibly well, but would also be good casual listening. Huge props to Uematsu and Narita and their work here. The last thing I wanted to touch on before wrapping it up is the visual presentation of the cinematics. I mean, visually, the entire game looks great, but these cinematics are when the team at Cygames really gets a chance to shine. All of them feature incredible lighting, detailed animations, and colors that really pop, especially on a nice display. Also, the attention to detail and world in the art direction is insane. Nothing ever looks even slightly out of place, and it all looks like it fits in this world. This is astounding, considering that the world is vastly different sky islands that all have unique biomes. I'd have to assume that this cohesion is a result of work done on the mobile game and influence taken from that side of things, but either way, it's remarkable and truly deserves a shout out. Also, if you can, play this game on an OLED. These cinematics pop on an LCD, but in 4K on an HDR OLED TV, the experience is just unmatched. We're at a point now where real-time rendering for games is almost on par with that of high-budget animated films, and it's really cool to see, especially on a nice display. Overall, Granblue Fantasy Relink is a solid ARPG with some pacing and gameplay issues in its third act. However, despite these issues, the game is carried to a solid, if slightly anticlimactic conclusion thanks to great visuals, satisfying character arcs, and a very engaging core gameplay system and progression loop. I'm sure people will be playing this game for years to come, and any fan of the anime or mobile game will feel right at home here. Scoring this game is hard though, and actually this gives me an excuse to discuss something that's come up frequently since I started this channel. So if you're unaware, I score things on a 4-point scale, 1 through 4. I do this because I usually feel one of 4 ways about a game. A 1 means you should save yourself time and never play it. Even if the game were free, I wouldn't recommend it. A 2 is a game I think might be worth it for particular people under particular circumstances. Not a good game, but a game where some people might get their money out of it. A 3 is a game I recommend. I don't love it, but I think it's worth checking out if you're interested. A 4 is a game I wholeheartedly recommend and implore anyone interested in the art form on a critical level to play as soon as possible. Relink falls in that middle range. It's right in between a 2 and a 3, but if I had to pick, I give Relink a 3. I think the good outweighs the bad here, and if you're really into ARPGs or Granblue, this one's a no-brainer, especially if you have friends to play with. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, make sure to like, comment to let me know your thoughts, and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future uploads. If you want to go the extra mile, you can join our free community Discord to talk about games, music, movies, and more, and you can go to Patreon or join our YouTube membership program to get early access to new content and exclusive content. Overall, I appreciate all the support from you guys lately on the channel, whether it's through shorts, memberships, comments, or just watching. It means a ton. Thanks for everything. You know where to find me. Peace!